The thermometer outside read 20 degrees below zero, but inside the round stone cabin, Anežka Dvořák's children slept without shivering. 3 miles away, the Cherney family would not survive the night in their rectangular log home. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, subscribe. Tomorrow's episode reveals another forgotten innovation that saved lives on the American frontier. The blizzard hit Nebraska territory on February 9, 1877, with a ferocity that settlers would remember for decades. Anežka Dvořák woke that morning to wind so violent it shook the log walls of their rectangular cabin. Her husband Joseph was already awake, feeding small pieces of wood into their corner fireplace. Their cabin was typical of homestead construction in the Nebraska plains, 20 feet by 16 feet, built from cottonwood logs hauled from the distant Platte River. The logs were notched at the corners and stacked, with mud and grass packed between them. A single door faced south. 2 small windows covered with oiled paper let in dim light. The fireplace occupied the northeast corner, built from prairie stone and mud mortar. Anežka rose from their bed and immediately felt the temperature difference across the room. Near the fireplace, the air was tolerably warm. 10 feet away, her breath formed clouds. She checked on their children, Ludmila and Václav, who slept bundled under every blanket the family owned. The wind increased throughout the morning. By midday, visibility outside had disappeared into a wall of white. Joseph kept the fire burning, but the wood supply inside the cabin was dwindling. The main woodpile was outside, 30 feet from the door. He told Anežka he would make a quick trip to bring more inside before conditions worsened. She watched him wrap cloth around his face and pull on his heaviest coat. He tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to the door handle. The precaution experienced plains settlers always took during blizzards. Men had frozen to death 20 feet from their cabins, disoriented in whiteout conditions. Joseph opened the door, and the wind nearly tore it from his hands. He pushed outside and disappeared immediately into the storm. Anežka waited by the door, holding the rope. She felt it pull and move as Joseph made his way to the woodpile. The children huddled near the fireplace. Minutes passed. The rope went slack. Anežka waited, counting heartbeats. Joseph should have been returning by now. She pulled on the rope. It came back easily, too easily. The end appeared through the doorway, frayed and broken. The knot had failed, or the rope had caught on something and torn. Anežka stood in the doorway, staring into the blizzard, screaming Joseph's name into wind that swallowed every sound. She could not go after him. Leaving the children alone would put all 3 of them at risk. She closed the door and fed the last of the interior. Wood into the fireplace. The temperature began to drop. She pulled the children into the bed and covered them with every piece of fabric in the cabin. The blizzard continued for 36 hours. The fireplace went cold after 6. Anežka kept her children alive through body heat and constant movement. On the second morning, when the wind finally stopped, she opened the door to clear dawn light. Joseph was 15 feet from the cabin, half buried in snow, frozen solid. He had gotten turned around in the whiteout. He had died within sight of his own home. Anežka buried Joseph on February 13, 1877, in frozen ground that required a pickaxe to penetrate. Karel Hajek and 3 other neighboring homesteaders helped dig the grave on a low rise overlooking the Dvořák claim. The wind had stopped, but the temperature remained brutal. Everyone worked quickly, spoke little, and returned to their cabins as soon as the last stone was placed on the grave mound. Anežka returned to her cabin with Mila and Slava and stared at the interior as if seeing it for the first time. The northeast corner where the fireplace stood drew her attention. That corner had always been the warmest spot in the cabin, but Joseph had died trying to keep it warm. She walked to the opposite corner, the southwest, and placed her hand against the logs. Ice crystals coated the interior surface. She moved to the southeast corner, equally cold. The northwest corner showed the same frozen condensation. Over the next week, Anežka visited 3 neighboring families, bringing small amounts of food as was customary after a death. But her real purpose was observation. She studied their cabins with intensity that made people uncomfortable. The Cherney family lived 3 miles east in a cabin almost identical to her own. Tomasz Cherney was a large man, confident and vocal about proper homesteading methods. His cabin was slightly larger than Anežka's, 24 feet by 18 feet, but the construction was the same. Notched log corners, mud chinking, corner fireplace. Anežka noticed immediately that the Cherney family avoided 2 corners of their cabin entirely. Barrels and crates were stacked in those spaces. When she asked Božena Cherney about it, the woman laughed bitterly and said those corners were impossible to keep warm, so they used them for storage that would not be damaged by cold. The family slept and lived in the half of the cabin nearest the fireplace. At the Novak homestead, Anežka saw the same pattern, a rectangular cabin with a corner fireplace. The family congregated near the heat source and abandoned the far corners to cold. She asked direct questions. How much wood did they burn in a winter? How cold did the cabin get on the worst nights? Did they ever wake to find water frozen in buckets inside? The answers revealed a consistent truth. Every rectangular cabin fought a losing battle against Plains winter. Families burned enormous amounts of wood, yet the corners remained frozen. The far walls stayed cold enough to freeze moisture. Children developed coughs from sleeping in damp, cold air. Elderly people suffered terribly. Anežka walked home across frozen prairie and studied the landscape with new awareness. In the distance, she could see Karel Hajek's grain silo, a cylindrical stone structure he had built to store wheat. The silo had no corners. She altered her path to walk past it and placed her hand against the stone. Even in brutal cold, the stone felt different than wood. It held a subtle warmth, as if something inside it resisted the temperature outside. They buried Joseph in frozen ground on a bright February morning. The small cemetery sat on a rise overlooking 3 homesteads, including Karel Hajek's prosperous farm. Karel was an older Czech immigrant who had arrived in Nebraska territory 10 years before most of his neighbors. His land showed the benefits of that early start. While others struggled in small cabins, Karel had built substantial structures, including a stone spring house, a large barn, and the cylindrical grain silo that dominated the landscape. After the burial, neighbors gathered at Karel's home, as was customary. Anežka stood apart from the group, her attention fixed on the grain silo, visible through the window. The structure was perhaps 12 feet in diameter and 15 feet tall, built entirely from stacked prairie stone. Karel used it to store wheat after harvest, protecting the grain from moisture and rodents. Anežka walked outside despite the cold and approached the silo. She circled it slowly, running her hand along the stone surface. The structure had no corners, just a continuous curved wall. She tried to imagine the interior temperature. Grain stored inside would be protected from temperature extremes. The stone walls would prevent the fierce temperature swings that plagued wooden buildings. Karel emerged from his house and walked toward her, his expression curious. He was a man in his 60s, weathered by Plains life but still strong. He asked if she was well, if there was anything he could provide for her and the children. Anežka thanked him, and then asked a question that made him pause. Why did his silo stay warmer than her cabin? Karel looked confused. He explained that the silo was not heated, that it was simply storage for grain. Anežka persisted. She had touched the stone. Even in bitter cold, it felt different than the wooden walls of her cabin. Why? Karel scratched his beard and said he had never considered it. Stone was simply what you built silos from. It kept grain dry and safe. But why round? Anežka asked. Why not build a rectangular silo? Karel shrugged. His father had built grain silos in Bohemia. They were always round. It was simply how it was done. The shape made the structure strong. A circle supported itself. He could not explain the physics, he said, but round buildings stood longer and required less. maintenance, then rectangular ones. Anežka asked if she could see inside. Karel retrieved a key and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The interior was dim and smelled of wheat dust. Anežka stepped inside and immediately noticed the temperature. It was not warm, but it was noticeably less cold than the outside air. The stone walls seemed to hold temperature, preventing the extreme cold from penetrating. She asked Karel if he had ever considered building a round house instead of a rectangular one. He laughed and said people would think him mad. Houses were rectangular. That was simply how houses were built. A round house would be strange, impractical, difficult to furnish. Anežka thanked him and returned to the gathering. But her mind was working through a problem that no one else seemed to recognize. Spring arrived slowly in Nebraska territory. By late March, the worst of the winter had passed, though frost still threatened each night. Anežka spent those weeks planning. Joseph had left her with a difficult decision. The homestead claim required continuous occupation and improvement. If she abandoned it, 5 years of work would be lost. But surviving alone with 2 young children presented challenges that seemed insurmountable to her neighbors. Tomasz Czerny visited in early April with a proposal. He would purchase her homestead claim for a modest sum. It would give him additional grazing land and spare Anežka the impossible task of working the claim alone. He presented this as generosity, a solution to her predicament. Anežka thanked him and said she would consider it, but she had already decided to stay. Iosif had died, proving that their cabin was inadequate. Anežka would not make the same mistake. She would build something better, something that would keep her children alive through the next winter. The rectangular cabin had failed. She would build something different. In mid-April, she loaded her children into the wagon, along with every item of value she could spare. Joseph's tools, excess furniture, spare blankets, everything that could be sold. She drove the wagon 30 miles to Omaha, a journey that took 2 days. Mila and Slava sat quietly in the back, understanding without being told that their mother was attempting something important. Omaha was the largest settlement in the territory, a growing city that served as the jumping-off point for westward migration. Anežka sold Joseph's tools to a hardware merchant for less than they were worth. She sold their excess belongings to various buyers throughout the city. By the end of the first day, she had $60 in cash, more money than she had held at one time in her life. Most widows in her position would have used that money for immediate needs: food, clothing, supplies to sustain the family through the coming months. Anežka spent it differently. She purchased thin rope and stakes for surveying. She bought a small book on practical mathematics from a general store. She invested in paper and pencils. And she spent her evenings walking through Omaha studying buildings. She examined the brick structures in the commercial district, noting how the bricks were laid in overlapping patterns that distributed weight. She studied stone foundations, observing how builders selected and fitted stones to create level bases. She watched construction crews working on a new bank building, paying particular attention to how they handled corners and joints. People noticed her interest. A widow studying construction techniques drew attention and questions. Anežka offered no detailed explanations. She simply said she needed to make repairs to her homestead buildings. Most accepted this and moved on. But one man paid closer attention to her questions. His name was Jakub Kovac, a stonemason from Moravia who had immigrated to Nebraska 5 years earlier. He was working on the foundation for a new bank building when Anežka approached with questions about stone selection. Most men would have dismissed a woman asking about construction techniques. Jakub simply answered her questions directly. She asked why he chose certain stones over others. He explained that flat stones stacked more securely than rounded ones. Stones with consistent thickness created more stable walls. He demonstrated how to test a stone's integrity by striking it with a hammer. A clear ring meant solid stone. A dull thud indicated fractures or weaknesses that would cause problems. Anežka watched him work for over an hour, noting his technique. He laid each stone carefully, checking level and fit before mortaring it in place. She asked why he used mortar at all. Could stones not be stacked without it? Jakub paused and looked at her with new interest. Yes, he said, dry stacking was possible. Ancient builders had created structures that lasted centuries without mortar, but it required careful stone selection and precise fitting. Each stone had to lock with its neighbors through weight and friction. She asked about corners. How did he ensure corners remained strong? Jakub showed her the interlocking pattern he used, where stones at corners extended into both walls, tying the structure together. Corners were always the weakest point in rectangular buildings, he explained. That was simply the nature of the geometry. Two walls meeting at an angle created stress points. What about round buildings? Anežka asked. Did they have the same corner problems? Jakub smiled. Round buildings had no corners, therefore no corner problems. The curve of the wall created inward compression, each stone pressed against its neighbors in a continuous arc. It was the strongest possible design for a given amount of material. Ancient Romans had understood this. Their circular towers and arenas had survived while rectangular buildings crumbled. Anežka asked the question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. Could a round stone building stay warmer than a rectangular wooden one? Jakub set down his tools and gave her his full attention. He asked why she wanted to know. Anežka told him about Joseph, about the frozen corners, about watching her husband die trying to keep an inadequate cabin warm. Jakub listened without interruption. When she finished, he explained something he called thermal mass. Stone, he said, absorbed heat slowly but released it slowly as well. Wood insulated against heat transfer, but it did not store heat. A stone building heated during the day would radiate that warmth for hours after the heat source was removed. A wooden building would cool almost immediately. He sketched a simple diagram in the dirt. A circle with a heat source at the center. The heat would radiate equally in all directions, warming all walls evenly. In a rectangular building with a corner fireplace, heat distribution was uneven. Some walls received more warmth than others. The far corners received almost none. Could a woman build such a structure alone? Anežka asked. Jakub considered the question seriously. It would require time and enormous physical effort, but yes, it was possible. Stone stacking required care and patience more than strength. If she could gather the stones and had the determination to work slowly and carefully, she could build it. Anežka returned to her homestead in late April with supplies that puzzled her neighbors. She carried surveying stakes and rope, a mathematics book, paper for sketching plans, and no food stores beyond bare necessities. Tomáš Černý visited within days, asking if she had reconsidered his offer to purchase her claim. She told him she intended to stay and make improvements to her buildings. What improvements? He asked, looking at her meager supplies. She told him she planned to build a new structure before winter. Tomáš laughed and asked what she could possibly build alone. Anežka said she would build something warm, something without corners where cold could settle and kill. Tomáš left, shaking his head, convinced that grief had affected her judgment. Anežka spent the next 2 weeks studying the mathematics book she had purchased. She had basic literacy in both Czech and English, learned from her mother, who had valued education. But mathematics, beyond simple arithmetic, was unfamiliar territory. She worked through problems by candlelight after her children slept, learning the relationship between diameter and circumference, understanding how to calculate the area of a circle. She needed to determine the optimal size for her structure. Too small, and her family would be cramped. Too large, and she would not finish before winter, and the interior would be difficult to heat. She sketched various sizes on paper, calculating how many square feet each would provide. She settled on 16 feet in diameter. The mathematics showed this would give her approximately 200 square feet of interior space, comparable to her current rectangular cabin. She practiced the geometry in the dirt, outside her existing cabin. She drove a stake in the ground and tied an 8-foot length of rope to it. With the rope pulled tight, she walked in a circle, dragging a stick to mark the path. The resulting circle was perfect. She repeated the process multiple times, ensuring she understood the technique completely. Mila and Slava watched their mother's strange activities with confusion. Anežka sat them down one evening and explained what she was attempting. She used their wooden bowls to demonstrate. A rectangular bowl had corners where food could stick and become trapped. A round bowl had no corners. Everything flowed smoothly. Heat, she explained, worked the same way. In their rectangular cabin, cold settled into corners and would not leave. In a round cabin, cold would have nowhere to hide. Slava asked if they would really build a round house. Anežka confirmed they would. Mila asked if people would laugh at them. Anežka said yes, people would definitely laugh, but they would be warm while others froze, and eventually the laughter would stop. She took her children to see Karel Hajek's grain silo again, explaining how the round shape made it strong. She pointed out how the silo had survived storms that had damaged rectangular barns. She showed them how the stones were stacked, each supporting its neighbors. This, she told them, was what they would build together. In early May, Anežka began marking the location for her new structure. She selected a spot 50 yards from the existing cabin on slightly elevated ground that would drain well. She drove her center stake deep into the prairie soil and marked a perfect circle 16 feet in diameter. Her neighbors, who saw the circle marked in the earth, assumed she was planning a well, or perhaps a root cellar. None imagined she intended to build a dwelling. The Nebraska prairie was not treeless because trees could not grow there. It was treeless because the Czechs, Germans, and other settlers had already cut down most of the cottonwoods along the creeks for cabin construction. But the prairie was rich in another building material that most homesteaders ignored. Limestone outcroppings broke through the soil in scattered locations, remnants of an ancient seabed that had once covered the entire region. Anežka had noticed these stone formations during her years on the claim, but had never considered them useful. Joseph had built with wood because that was what everyone did. Now she studied the limestone exposures with different eyes. The stone was sedimentary, formed in layers that made it naturally flat. Weather and erosion had already broken much of it into manageable pieces. What she needed was lying on the ground, waiting to be collected. She fashioned a stone boat from planks salvaged from an old wagon bed. The device was simple, a flat platform that dragged along the ground behind her ox. It could not carry as much as a wheeled wagon, but it moved more easily over rough prairie and did not require maintained paths. She loaded Mila and Slava into the stone boat with water and food, then set out to map the limestone deposits within reasonable hauling distance. Over 3 days, she identified 7 locations where usable stone was abundant. The nearest was half a mile from her building site. The farthest was nearly 2 miles away. She made careful notes about each location, estimating the quantity of suitable stone available. She calculated that she would need approximately 400 stones of various sizes to complete her circular wall. Each stone would need to be evaluated, transported, and placed individually. The work began in mid-May. Each morning, Anežka harnessed the ox and dragged the stone boat to one of her marked locations. She taught her children how to evaluate stones. Flat surfaces on top and bottom were essential. Relatively consistent thickness made stacking easier. Stones, longer than they were wide, provided more stability. They learned to reject rounded stones, fractured stones, and stones with significant irregularities. Loading the stone boat was physical labor that exhausted Anežka by midday. Each stone weighed between 20 and 60 pounds. She could load perhaps 15 to 20 stones per trip, representing between 400 and 800 pounds of material. The ox pulled the load steadily back to the building site, where Anežka unloaded each stone and stacked it according to size. Tomáš Černý rode past one afternoon and stopped to watch Anežka hauling stones. He asked what she was building. "A cabin," she replied. "From stone?" he asked, incredulous. She confirmed this. Tomáš shook his head and said she was wasting her time. Stone buildings required skilled masons and multiple workers. A woman alone could not possibly accomplish it. Besides, he added, everyone knew that stone buildings were cold in winter. Stone drew heat out of a building. Anežka continued working without responding. She had learned from Jakub Kovač that the opposite was true. Stone absorbed heat and released it slowly. But explaining this to Tomáš seemed pointless. He would understand when winter came if he survived to see it. The stone collection continued through May and into June. Anežka made between 2 and 4 trips daily depending on distance and stone quality at each location. By late June, Anežka had accumulated a substantial pile of limestone sorted by size and quality. She had also spent considerable time preparing the ground within her marked circle. The prairie soil was thick with grass roots, matted layers that had accumulated over centuries. She dug through this with a spade, removing vegetation and topsoil to a depth of 8 inches across the entire 16-foot diameter. Beneath the topsoil, she encountered harder clay soil, dense and relatively level. This would be her foundation. She used a long, straight plank and a simple level, a glass tube partially filled with water that Joseph had owned. She checked the excavated surface in multiple directions, removing high spots and filling low areas with compacted clay. The process took a full week of careful work. Karel Hajic visited during this preparation and watched Anežka working in her circular excavation. He asked direct questions. Was she truly building a dwelling? Yes. Round like his grain silo? Yes. Did she understand how much work this would require? She met his eyes and asked if he understood how cold his rectangular house became in winter. Karel had no response to this. He asked if she needed help. Anežka declined. She explained that she needed to build this herself, to understand every aspect of the construction. If something failed, she needed to know why and how to fix it. If she relied on others for construction knowledge, she would be helpless when problems occurred. Karel nodded slowly, understanding the logic even if he questioned the feasibility. The foundation course was the most critical element of the entire structure. Anežka selected the largest, flattest stones from her collection for this purpose. Each stone in the foundation would bear the weight of every stone above it. She laid them carefully around the circumference of her circle, checking constantly with her rope to ensure the curve remained true. The foundation stones did not form a complete ring. Anežka left a gap 4 feet wide on the south side for her doorway. She placed particularly large, solid stones at each side of this gap, knowing they would support the door frame and bear additional stress. Each foundation stone was leveled individually. Anežka used small stone chips as shims, sliding them under low spots until her water level showed true horizontal. She tested each stone by standing on it and shifting her weight. Any movement required adjustment. The foundation could not settle or shift. Everything above depended on this base remaining stable. The work was slow and meticulous. She completed the foundation ring over 10 days, placing approximately 60 stones. When finished, she had a circular base 16 feet in diameter with a 4-foot gap for the doorway. The foundation sat slightly below the surrounding ground level, which would help protect it from frost heaving during winter freeze-thaw cycles. She stood in the center of her circle that evening as the sun set, measuring distances with her rope. 8 feet in every direction to the wall, no corners, no cold spots where heat could not reach. Slava asked when they would start stacking the walls. Soon, Anežka told him. Very soon. The first wall course went up in early July. Anežka had studied Jakub Kovač's technique carefully and understood the principle. Each stone had to sit solidly on the stones beneath it with maximum contact area. Gaps meant instability. Wobbling meant eventual failure. She selected stones for the first course that were relatively uniform in height, approximately 6 inches thick. She laid them directly on the foundation stones, arranging each carefully before committing to its position. The technique required patience. She would place a stone, check it from multiple angles, remove it, try a different stone, Repeat the process until she found the right fit. Mila asked why she did not simply stack them quickly. Anežka explained that each mistake would multiply upward through every course above it. The dry stack method meant no mortar held the stones together. Gravity, friction, and careful fitting provided all the strength. This seemed impossible to neighbors who stopped to watch. Božena Černý visited and expressed concern. How would the walls stay standing without mortar? Anežka pointed to Carol's grain silo, which had stood for 9 years using similar technique. Božena remained skeptical. The interlocking pattern was crucial. Anežka never placed two vertical joints adjacent to each other. Each stone bridged the gap between two stones below it, similar to bricklaying patterns. This distributed weight and prevented vertical fracture lines from forming. She used longer stones at intervals to tie the inner and outer faces of the wall together, creating a structure that was effectively 2 feet thick. The thickness was necessary for thermal mass. Thin walls, even of stone, would not store enough heat to make a difference. 2 feet of limestone would absorb enormous amounts of thermal energy during the day and release it slowly through the night. This was the principle that would keep her family alive when winter returned. Progress was measured in inches per day. A good day saw 1 complete course added around the circumference, approximately 60 stones placed. A difficult day might see only half that. Anežka worked from dawn until her hands could no longer grip stone, then spent evenings teaching her children to read by candlelight. Education could not stop because they were building. By late July, the wall stood 3 feet high. The circular shape was clearly visible now, rising from the prairie like an ancient ruin. Travelers on the distant road sometimes stopped to stare at the strange structure. Some rode closer to investigate. Anežka answered questions politely but briefly. Yes, it would be a dwelling. No, she did not need help. Yes, she understood it was unusual. Tomáš Černý visited again and examined the construction closely. He pushed against the wall, testing its strength. The stones did not move. He asked what would happen when winter wind hit the structure. Anežka said the curve would deflect wind rather than resisting it directly. Tomáš walked away shaking his head, convinced the entire endeavor was folly that would collapse before completion. August brought heat that made stone work exhausting. The limestone absorbed sunlight and became almost too hot to handle by mid-afternoon. Anežka adjusted her schedule, working intensively from dawn until noon, resting during peak heat, then working again in the evening. As temperatures dropped, the wall continued to rise, passing 4 feet in height by mid-month. Mila had been asking questions about why round was better than rectangular. One evening, Anežka decided to provide a demonstration. She built a small fire outside and placed 2 iron pots near it. One pot was rectangular, salvaged from a broken baking pan. The other was their round cooking pot. She positioned them equal distances from the fire and waited. After 20 minutes, she had her children touch both pots carefully. The round pot was warm all over. The rectangular pot was hot on the side facing the fire, but cool on the far side and cold in the corners. Heat had distributed evenly through the round pot, but had concentrated and then dissipated unevenly in the rectangular one. This, Anežka explained, was exactly what happened in their old cabin. The corner fireplace heated one corner intensely. Heat tried to spread to other areas but got trapped, rose to the roof, and escaped. The far corners never received adequate warmth because heat had to travel through cold air to reach them and lost energy along the way. In a round cabin with central heat, distance from the heat source to any wall point was identical. Heat would radiate equally in all directions. No corner could remain cold because there were no corners to trap cold air. The circular wall would absorb heat uniformly and release it uniformly back into the living space. Slava asked about wind. Their old cabin had terrible drafts when wind blew from certain directions. How would the round cabin handle wind? Anežka took a flat board and a round bowl outside. She had Slava blow on the flat board. His breath hit it directly and created turbulence around the edges. Then she had him blow on the round bowl. His breath flowed smoothly around the curve without creating the same turbulent effect. Wind, hitting a flat wall, she explained, created pressure that forced air through any gap in the construction. Wind hitting a curved wall was deflected around the structure. The round shape actually reduced wind pressure on the walls. This meant fewer drafts and less cold air infiltration. The children understood through these demonstrations what their mother was attempting. She was not simply building a different shape. She was building a structure that worked with the physics of heat and cold, rather than fighting against them. Every rectangular cabin on the plains fought a battle against winter that it could not win. Anežka was designing a structure where winter would have no advantage. By the end of August, the wall stood 5 feet high. Anežka could no longer simply lift stones into place. She constructed a simple ramp from boards, allowing her to roll heavy stones up to the working height. The technique was slow but effective. Each stone still required careful fitting and checking before being locked into position. September arrived with cooler temperatures that made stone work more comfortable. The wall now stood 5.5 feet high, approaching its final height of 6 feet. At this point, something remarkable became apparent to anyone who examined the structure closely. The circular wall was becoming stronger as it rose, not weaker. In rectangular construction, walls became less stable as they increased in height. The weight at the top pressed down on corners that were already the weakest points in the structure. Tall rectangular walls required internal bracing or external buttressing to remain vertical. Anežka's circular wall required neither. The geometry of a circle created inward compression. Each stone pressed against its neighbors in a continuous arc. The weight from above compressed the entire circumference simultaneously, creating a self-supporting structure. Karol Hajek explained this to several neighbors who had gathered to watch Anežka work one afternoon. He pointed out how ancient Roman aqueducts used arches for this same reason. An arch was simply a vertical slice of a circle. The curved shape made it far stronger than a flat lintel of the same material. Anežka's entire cabin was effectively a continuous arch, a horizontal circle that used the same physics. The structure would actually become more stable once the roof weight was added, pressing down evenly on all points of the circumference. Tomasz Czerny remained unconvinced. He argued that stone was inherently unstable without mortar. He predicted the first hard frost would crack the joints and collapse the wall. Karol responded by pointing to his grain silo, which had survived 9 winter freeze-thaw cycles without mortar and without failure. Tomasz had no answer to this observation. The doorway required special attention. Anežka had left a 4-foot gap in the circle for the door. This gap interrupted the continuous compression of the circular wall. She needed to bridge this opening in a way that maintained structural integrity. Her solution was a simple arch. She constructed a temporary wooden form, a curved support that spanned the doorway. Using her longest stones, she built the arch carefully, placing a central keystone at the apex. Once the keystone was in position and the stones on either side were locked in place, the arch became self-supporting. She removed the wooden form and the arch held, bearing the weight of the wall above it. The arch was not decorative. It was functional physics. The curved shape directed the weight of the upper wall downward and outward to the solid walls on either side of the doorway. The opening could support substantial weight without risk of collapse. This same principle had preserved Roman buildings for 2,000 years. By mid-September, the wall reached its full height of 6 feet. Anežka stood outside and examined her work with satisfaction. She had placed approximately 400 stones over 4 months of continuous labor. The circular wall was complete, solid, and ready for the roof. With the walls complete, Anežka turned her attention to the heating system. she had salvaged the small iron stove from their original cabin, a basic box stove that Joseph had purchased in Omaha. The stove was inefficient by modern standards, but it would serve her purpose. The key was placement and chimney design. In their rectangular cabin, the stove had sat in a corner. This seemed logical to most builders. Corner placement kept the stove out of the way and used the corner walls as protective backing. But Anežka had learned this was the worst possible location. Corner placement meant heat radiated outward in only one direction, toward the interior of the room. Half the stove's heat was lost to the walls immediately behind and beside it. She positioned her iron stove in the exact center of the circle. She measured carefully from all sides to ensure perfect centering. In this position, the stove would radiate heat equally in all directions. Every point on the circular wall was 8 feet from the heat source. No area would be favored or neglected. The entire structure would warm evenly. The chimney presented a technical challenge. She needed to bring the stovepipe straight up through the roof, but the roof did not exist yet. She would have to build the chimney first, then construct the roof around it. She salvaged the stovepipe sections from the old cabin, 6 sections of sheet metal pipe that connected to form a chimney approximately 9 feet tall. She built a base for the stove using flat stones laid in a square pattern. This protected the earthen floor from heat and provided stable support. The stove sat on this base with the pipe extending straight upward. She temporarily supported the pipe with wooden braces while she planned the roof structure. The chimney would need to extend above the roof peak to ensure proper draft. Smoke had to escape freely without being pushed back down by wind. She calculated that the roof peak would be approximately 8 feet above the floor level. The chimney needed to extend at least 2 feet above that, requiring a total height of 10 feet from stove to pipe top. She added 2 more sections of pipe, bringing the chimney to the required height. The pipe sections fit together with simple friction joints, each section sliding inside the one below it. This was not ideal for long-term use. She would need to seal the joints eventually, but for now, the chimney was functional. Mila asked why the chimney was in the middle instead of in a corner like their old cabin. Anežka explained using simple terms. Imagine the stove is the sun. In the old cabin, the sun was in the corner. Half the room stayed in shadow and cold. Now the sun was in the center. Every part of the room would receive equal light and warmth. No shadows, no cold spots. The positioning was complete. The iron stove sat on its stone base in the perfect center of the circular room. The chimney extended straight upward, ready to receive the roof structure that would be built around it. With the walls complete and the chimney positioned, Anežka took time to understand what she had built. The structure represented more than simple shelter. It was a heat storage system, though she lacked the technical vocabulary to describe it in those terms. What she understood intuitively was that the mass of stone surrounding her would absorb warmth during the day and release it at night. She calculated the approximate weight of her walls using simple mathematics. Each stone averaged perhaps 40 pounds. She had placed roughly 400 stones. That meant 16,000 pounds of limestone surrounded her living space, 8 tons of rock. The number seemed impossible, yet she had moved every pound of it herself over 4 months of labor. 8 tons of stone had properties that wood did not possess. Wood was light, easy to work, and provided insulation that slowed heat transfer. But wood did not store heat. A wooden cabin heated quickly when a fire burned and cooled just as quickly when the fire died. Stone behaved differently. It heated slowly, absorbing thermal energy gradually, but once warm, it released that heat over many hours. Anežka had observed this principle in Jakub Kovac's explanation, in Carol's grain silo, and in her own experiments with heated stones. A stone placed near a fire would remain warm to the touch long after being removed from the heat. Wood cooled almost immediately. The difference would determine whether her children survived the coming winter. She explained her reasoning to Carol one afternoon when he visited to inspect the completed walls. 8 tons of limestone would require enormous energy to heat initially, But once the stone absorbed heat, it would maintain temperature far more effectively than any wooden structure. On a winter day, she would burn her fire steadily. The stone would absorb heat continuously. When she let the fire die at night to conserve wood, the stone would release stored heat for hours, perhaps until morning. Carol asked about the thickness of the walls. 2 feet seemed excessive. Could she not have built thinner walls and used less stone? Anežka shook her head. Thickness was essential. A thin stone wall would heat and cool too quickly, behaving more like wood. 2 feet of stone created enough mass to truly store thermal energy. The investment in thickness would pay itself back every winter night when the fire was out, but her children stayed warm. She did not mention the mathematics to Carol, but she had calculated approximate temperature retention. If the stone absorbed heat until it reached 60 degrees throughout its mass, it would release that heat over approximately 6 to 8 hours as the interior temperature dropped. This matched the typical duration from evening fire out until morning relight. The stone would carry her family through the coldest part of each night. The principle was simple. Mass equals thermal stability. Her rectangular wooden cabin had minimal mass and therefore no stability. Temperature inside swung wildly with exterior conditions. Her stone circle had enormous mass and would resist temperature change in both directions. It would be slower to heat initially, but once warm, it would maintain temperature through the brutal plains winter. October arrived with the first frost warnings. Anežka needed to complete the roof before winter weather made work impossible. She had studied various roofing techniques during her time in Omaha, but most required materials she could not afford. Wood shingles were expensive. Tar paper was unavailable locally. Thatch required grasses she had not prepared. The solution lay beneath her feet. Across the entire prairie, sod was the material that built most prairie homes. Entire houses were constructed from blocks of grass and soil cut from the earth. These sod houses, called soddies, were dark, often damp, but surprisingly durable and well insulated. Anežka did not want a complete soddy. She wanted stone walls for thermal mass. But a sod roof would provide insulation superior to any other available material. She began by constructing a roof frame from cottonwood poles. She had purchased 12 straight poles in Omaha, each about 6 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. These would span from the top of the circular wall to the central chimney, creating a conical frame. She notched the ends of each pole where they would rest on the stone wall, distributing weight evenly around the circumference. The poles were heavy. Positioning them required her to work in sections, temporarily propping each pole until she could secure it. She spaced them evenly around the circle, creating 12 radial supports. The tops of the poles met at the chimney, where she lashed them together with rope around the stovepipe. The structure resembled a native tipi frame, though built from heavier materials. Across these radial poles, she laid smaller branches in a spiral, patterned from the chimney outward to the walls. These created a lattice that would support the sod. The branches were willow, flexible and strong, cut from creek banks. She lashed them to the main poles with cord made from twisted grass. The result was a conical framework that left the chimney pipe extending through the peak. The sod cutting began in late October. Anežka used a spade sharpened to a razor edge. She cut rectangular blocks approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 4 inches thick. Each block weighed perhaps 30 pounds, heavy with soil and the dense root system of prairie grass. The roots held the block together, making it a structural unit rather than loose dirt. She cut blocks from the area surrounding her cabin, creating a slight depression in the prairie. This would actually benefit her by directing runoff away from the structure. She stacked the blocks near the cabin wall, accumulating several hundred, before beginning the actual roof installation, laying. The sod required working from bottom to top in a spiral pattern. She placed the first course of blocks around the perimeter where the roof frame met the stone wall. Each block sat grass side down on the willow lattice. The soil face was exposed upward. She overlapped the blocks like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. The weight accumulated quickly. Each course added hundreds of pounds to the roof structure. Anežka watched carefully for any sign of stress in the frame. The cottonwood poles held firm, distributing the load to the stone walls. The roof was completed on November 3, 1877. The final sod blocks were placed as the first significant cold front approached from the north. Anežka could see the weather change in the sky, clouds building, and the wind shifting to come straight down from Canada. The timing was fortunate. Within 2 days, hard frost arrived. She spent those 2 days moving their essential possessions from the old rectangular cabin to the new round structure. Bedding, cooking implements, food stores, tools, clothing. Everything her family needed to survive fit easily within the 200 square feet of circular space. The children were excited and nervous. The round cabin was strange, unlike any home they had seen. The first night in the new structure, Anežka lit a fire in the central stove at dusk. The temperature outside was dropping toward 20 degrees. She fed the fire steadily for 4 hours, burning more wood than seemed necessary. She was not just heating air, she was heating 8 tons of stone. The walls needed to absorb warmth before they could radiate it back. By 10 o'clock, the interior felt comfortably warm. Anežka could touch the stone walls and feel heat radiating from them. The stones near the stove were almost too hot to touch. Even the stones by the door held noticeable warmth. She let the fire burn down to coals and then die completely. This was the test. In their old, rectangular cabin, the temperature would plummet within an hour of the fire dying. Cold would seep in through gaps and corners. By morning, water in buckets would freeze solid. Anežka and her children would wake shivering despite heavy blankets. That was normal. That was what prairie winter meant. Tonight was different. She woke several times to check the temperature. At midnight, 3 hours after the fire died, the interior remained warm. She could not see her breath, the reliable indicator of cold indoor air. At 2 in the morning, she checked again. Still warm. The stone walls were releasing their stored heat steadily into the space. At dawn, Anežka rose and immediately checked conditions. Outside, frost coated everything. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees overnight. Inside the round stone cabin, the air was cool but not cold. She estimated perhaps 55 degrees, possibly 60. Her children slept comfortably under a single blanket each. No shivering, no frost, forming on interior walls. She stepped outside and walked to their old rectangular cabin. The door stood open. She had left it that way deliberately. Inside, the temperature was barely above freezing. Water in a bucket showed ice forming at the surface. The northeast corner where Joseph had frozen was bitterly cold. The contrast was undeniable and measurable. Anežka returned to the round cabin and relit the morning fire. The stone walls had worked exactly as she predicted. They had absorbed heat during the evening and released it through the night. The thermal mass had carried her family through the coldest hours with no active heating. The principle was sound. The innovation was proven. Now she needed to survive the true test that would come in the depths of winter. January 1878 brought weather that tested every structure on the Nebraska prairie. A massive storm system moved south from the Dakota Territory, bringing sustained temperatures of 20 below zero and wind that created conditions far more dangerous than simple cold. The wind chill, though settlers had no term for this concept yet, pushed the effective temperature to 40 or 50 below. The storm arrived on January 15th with little warning. The sky turned gray at mid-morning, and by noon snow was falling horizontally in sheets. Anežka secured everything outside that could blow away and brought her children inside. She fed the central stove steadily through the afternoon, maintaining a strong fire. The stone walls absorbed heat, while outside conditions deteriorated. By evening, the temperature had plummeted. Anežka could hear wind howling across the prairie, But inside the round stone cabin, the sound was muted. The curved walls deflected the wind rather than resisting it directly. There was no banging or shaking, no sense that the structure was fighting against the storm. The cabin simply existed within the weather, unmoved. She maintained the fire until 10 o'clock, then let it burn down. This was calculated risk. Her wood supply was limited. She could not burn continuously for days if the storm persisted. She needed to trust that the thermal mass would carry them through the night. The children slept soundly, unaware that their mother was conducting an experiment with their lives. At midnight, Anežka checked the temperature using a simple method. She breathed out and watched for vapor. In extreme cold, breath became visible cloud. Her breath showed faint mist, but nothing like the dense clouds that formed outside. She estimated the interior was perhaps 55 degrees. The stone was working. 3 miles away, the Cherney family was fighting for survival. Their rectangular cabin leaked wind through every gap in the chinking. The corner fireplace blazed continuously, burning furniture when their wood supply ran out. Tomasz fed the fire desperately while Božena huddled with their children near the flames. The far corners of the cabin were fatally cold. The storm continued through the next day and into a second night. Anežka relit her fire in the morning and maintained it through daylight hours, allowing the stone to recharge. Each night she let the fire die. Each night the stone carried them through. Her wood supply held. The children remained healthy. The curved walls shed wind without creating the pressure differentials that forced cold air through rectangular structures. On the morning of January 18th, the storm broke. Sun emerged into a crystalline sky. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the wind stopped. Anežka opened her door and saw a landscape transformed by snow. Drifts reached the roof lines of some structures. The prairie had become an Arctic desert. She walked to check on her neighbors, a duty everyone performed after major storms. At the Hajek farm, Karol and his family had survived, though they reported burning through most of their winter wood supply. At the Novak homestead, everyone was alive but the pa. Children showed signs of frostbite on fingers and toes. At the Cherney cabin, Anežka found tragedy. Tomasz and Božena had frozen to death sometime during the second night. Anežka found them in the northeast corner of their cabin, the same corner where Joseph had died the previous year. Tomasz and Božena Cherney had pulled every blanket in the house around themselves and their children, trying to create warmth through insulation alone. The children had survived, barely, their small bodies generating enough heat to sustain them. But Tomasz and Božena had succumbed to hypothermia sometime during the second night of the storm. The scene was horrifically familiar. The corner fireplace had burned out when their wood ran out. Tomasz had fed it chairs, a table, anything combustible. But the rectangular cabin could not hold heat. Cold air poured through gaps in the chinking. Wind pressure forced freezing air through every weakness in the construction. The far corners where the family had retreated received no warmth at all even when the fire burned. Anežka took the Cherney children back to her round stone cabin. She fed them hot soup and wrapped them in blankets. They sat near her central stove, warming themselves from heat that radiated equally in all directions. The contrast was impossible to ignore. These children had nearly frozen to death, while Mila and Slava slept comfortably 3 miles away. Over the next week, neighbors gathered to bury Tomasz and Božena and to discuss what had happened. The conversation was uncomfortable. The Cherney family had done everything according to standard practice. They had built a rectangular cabin like everyone else. They had placed a fireplace in the corner like everyone else. They had stocked wood and prepared for winter like everyone else. Yet they had died while Anežka and her children survived comfortably. Karol Hajek spoke plainly at the gathering. He had visited Anežka's round-stone cabin multiple times during the cold spell. He reported that her interior temperature remained stable even when the fire was out. The stone walls absorbed and released heat continuously. The circular shape eliminated cold corners. The design worked exactly as she had predicted. Several families asked Anežka for advice on building similar structures. She shared her knowledge freely, explaining the principles of thermal mass, circular geometry, and central heating. She showed them how to select stones, how to dry stack them, how to position everything for maximum efficiency. Some listened carefully, others remained skeptical, unwilling to abandon rectangular construction despite clear evidence of its failure. By late January, 3 families had committed to building round stone cabins before the next winter. Carol agreed to help with the heavy work. Anežka provided detailed guidance on every aspect of construction. The innovation was spreading, slowly but inevitably, through a community that had paid a terrible price for clinging to traditional methods. The Cherney children remained with Anežka through the winter. In spring, relatives from Iowa came to claim them. Before leaving, the oldest child asked Anežka why her parents had not built a round house. Anežka had no answer except the truth. Because no one had shown them, it was possible. Spring 1878 brought construction activity unusual for the Nebraska prairie. 7 families began building round stone cabins using variations of Anežka's technique. Some built smaller circles, some larger. Some used mortar between stones for faster construction. Others followed Anežka's dry stack method precisely. But all shared the core principles: circular walls, central heating, thermal mass, and thick sod roofs. The innovation spread beyond simple imitation. A stonemason from Omaha heard about the round cabins and traveled to see them. He returned to the city with detailed sketches and began offering circular stone construction as a service. By 1880, round stone cabins had appeared across eastern Nebraska and into Kansas. The design was particularly popular among Czech and German immigrants who had cultural memories of European round towers and understood masonry. Anežka became known locally as the widow who built the warm house. People sought her advice on construction, on stone selection, on roof design. She answered questions generously, but never claimed special expertise. She had simply observed, learned, and applied principles that others had overlooked. The knowledge belonged to anyone willing to use it. Her own life settled into sustainable routine. The round stone cabin required minimal maintenance. The roof needed occasional sod replacement where grass died, but the structure itself remained solid year after year. Her wood consumption was perhaps 60% of what other families burned. The thermal mass reduced heating needs substantially. Mila and Slava grew up in the round stone cabin, never experiencing the brutal cold that had killed their father and the Cherney parents. They understood warmth as normal, not as a luxury fought for each winter night. In 1892, Mila married and moved to Lincoln. In 1895, Slava homesteaded his own claim in the Sand Hills and built a round stone cabin using his mother's technique. Anežka lived until 1903, reaching the age of 73. She died quietly in her sleep during a mild October night, her stone walls holding steady warmth around her. She was buried beside Joseph on the rise overlooking her homestead. Her gravestone recorded her name and dates, but made no mention of her innovation or the lives saved by her work. The round stone cabin stood for another 60 years. Various families occupied it, each benefiting from Anežka's obsessive attention to thermal efficiency. The structure survived storms, droughts, and the gradual abandonment of homesteads as farming. Technology changed settlement patterns. By 1960, the cabin was abandoned but still structurally sound. Historians estimate that round stone construction techniques saved dozens of lives during the brutal winters of the late 1800s. Exact numbers are impossible to determine because survival generates fewer records than tragedy. But accounts from the period reference families surviving storms that killed neighbors, specifically because their round cabins held heat when rectangular structures failed. The principle Anežka discovered was simple: geometry and mass defeat cold more effectively than insulation and fuel. A round stone building with central heating and adequate thermal mass requires less energy to maintain comfortable temperature than a rectangular wooden building with corner heating and minimal mass. The 55-degree difference the title references was real and measurable and meant the difference between life and death on the Nebraska prairie. Today, most of those round stone cabins are gone, returned to the prairie or buried under modern development. But a few remain, testament to one widow's refusal to accept that traditional methods were the only methods. Anežka Dvořák proved that necessity, observation, and determination could solve problems that killed experienced settlers. Her legacy was not fame or fortune, but warmth, the simple preservation of her children through winters that took so many others.